Welcome to the 11th in a series of 20 devotionals in the Lent and Art Devotional series by Kelly Bagdanov. In this devotional, there are two basic parts. The first is called the reading. Every painting tells a story, and we want to read the meaning. In this part of the devotional, Kelly provides needed items of background that will help you to read the painting. The second part is the contemplation. Kelly will give you some guidance, but she really wants you to engage with the painting and let it speak to you. We cover 20 paintings in the whole devotional. The subject for this video is a painting entitled Christ Carrying the Cross by Titian. It was painted in 1505 and is presently on display in the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice, Italy. Thanks for joining us on this tour of Lenten art, and here is Kelly.
Today we'll be looking at a work of Christ Carrying the Cross by the artist Titian. Titian is one of the giants of the Italian Renaissance. A Venetian painter, he was the undisputed master in Venice for 60 years. Titian began his artistic journey at the age of 9 when his father brought him to work with a family friend, Sebastian Zuccato, in Venice. Around the age of 13, Titian moved to the workshop of Gentile Bellini, and upon Gentile's death, he went to Giovanni Bellini's workshop. At the time, Giovanni had the largest workshop in Venice, and Titian was able to participate in some very large projects. You'll remember our work of Jesus praying in the garden was by Giovanni Bellini. When Bellini died, Titian was brought in to complete the commissions that Bellini hadn't been able to finish, having already earned a stellar reputation throughout Venice. During this time with Bellini, Titian got to know another artist in the workshop by the name of Giorgione. Giorgione and Titian worked together on many projects, and that practice has generated a great deal of scholarly debate over the centuries, with experts trying to determine who painted what. Unfortunately for the art world, Giorgione died quite young. In fact, he and Giovanni Bellini died within a few years of each other, leaving Titian the undisputed master of art in Venice. Titian went on to live a long, productive life, and over 60 years of painting continued to develop and change his art. Dante's poem, Paradise Lost, ends with the line, "The sun admits small stars." This line of poetry was used to refer to Titian even during his lifetime. Titian was the first artist to have a mainly international clientele. He painted for Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and Philip II of Spain. Within Venice, his workshop couldn't keep up with the demand for his work. A versatile artist, he excelled at portraits, landscapes, altarpieces, and grand mythological works. Charles V was so impressed by one portrait Titian did of him that he knighted Titian and made all of his children nobles. This was a great honor, rarely bestowed. The particular painting that inspired this grand gesture was of Charles V astride a war horse in full armor. The work started a new genre in painting, inspired by ancient Roman sculptures of generals on horseback. Titian incorporated the ideals of the medieval knight and then added his own stamp. Charles V is recognizable, but Titian was able to paint his face with a subtlety that few could achieve. Charles looks as if he bears the weight of being king. There is a hint of weariness that makes the painting remarkable. We see that his kingship rests on his shoulders with gravity. He takes his responsibilities seriously. This is not a frivolous, wasteful king, but a serious ruler who leads with a steady hand. It is that ability to capture emotion, to use subtle expressions, to bring a feeling of truth to the painting that is Titian's gift, and one he employed in the painting of Christ carrying the cross. Christ carrying the cross was a common subject for Renaissance painters. However, this painting is unique in that Titian has limited the people in it to just Christ and Simon the Cyrene. This is a unique composition, and one that Titian will return to again and again. The first time Titian painted Christ and Simon the Cyrene was for a painting commissioned by Philip II of Spain. The work we're looking at today was painted 5 years later for Francesco Zuccato, the son of Titian's first teacher. By this time, Francesco and his brother had become successful mosaicists. Contemporaries of Titian confirm that Francesco himself is the model for the figure of Simon. The work is close cropped, with just the essentials included. The cross cuts diagonally through the picture plane, with Simon on one side and Christ on the other. The figures are pushed into the foreground, adding to the immediacy and emotional intensity of the work. The way Titian has framed the two makes the relationship between them almost intimate, as Simon seeks to raise the weight of the cross off Christ, easing his suffering. What is really striking about this painting is the face of Christ looking directly out at us. With blood on his brow, bloodshot eyes, and tears on his cheeks, his suffering is palpable. Christ's expression is where we see the genius of Titian. Christ's gaze toward us feels personal. We feel he is communicating with us. Every thorn in his crown is crisp and clear. Cruelly shoved into his flesh, many of the thorns are covered in blood. Additionally, there is a rope or noose around his neck. We can imagine his bloodied back from his scourging and know that his suffering isn't at an end. This is the suffering servant, and we are moved by the cost of Christ's sacrifice. At this point in the story, Christ has already been scourged, a punishment that by itself could lead to death. So the soldiers expected Christ wouldn't be capable of carrying the cross all the way to the place of his execution. Mark 15:21 says, "A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross." There's a theory that Titian created layers of meaning in the painting with the figure of Simon. Our surface reading is that this is Simon the Cyrene, who is mentioned in each of the Gospels as being pressed into service to carry the cross when Christ collapses. Our contemplation of the painting will be done by exploring three of the theories about Simon. As you listen, consider carefully this man and what it means to take up the cross of Christ. Simon is mentioned in each of the synoptic Gospels in one verse about carrying the cross. While this appears straightforward, an interesting theory has been suggested, and I'll give a quick rundown of it here. Simon is from Cyrene, which is located in northern Africa in modern-day Libya. 100,000 Judean Jews had been forcibly relocated there between 200 and 280 BC, so we know there was a large Jewish population in the city. It is likely that Simon, along with his two sons, Rufus and Alexander, had traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Can you imagine being Simon, grabbed randomly out of the crowd by a soldier to carry Christ's cross? I imagine a mix of emotions: fear, embarrassment, anger, confusion, pity. All would swirl in your mind as you struggled to carry the cross, walking behind Christ. We don't know if he'd heard of Christ before that day, if he'd been curious and come to watch, if perhaps he'd even heard Christ teach. We don't know if he immediately left the scene once the cross was delivered, or if he stayed to watch the drama he'd been dragged into unfold. It is hardly a stretch to think that he was still in Jerusalem on Sunday and heard the news that Jesus had risen, or at least that the body had disappeared. Having played a part in the horror of the day, I can only imagine Simon would follow the story a bit more closely than others. We know that there were people from Cyrene at Pentecost. Is it possible Simon had remained in Jerusalem and was present to hear Peter preach, to perhaps be converted that day? We also know that one of the earliest Christian churches was in Cyrene, and again, it makes sense that the man forced to carry Christ's cross would tell the story when he returned home. Mark mentions that Simon traveled with his sons, and he names them. This is an odd detail to include, because how would anyone know he traveled with his sons and their names? And secondly, it's not pertinent to the story that Mark is telling. That is, unless Mark knew the sons. In Romans, Paul sends greetings to Rufus. Could this Rufus be Simon's son, who was there that day when his father carried the cross? There the day the news came out that Jesus had risen? There the day of Pentecost when the church was born? Was Rufus now a leader in the church in Rome? It's all speculation, but it's fascinating to consider. Simon carried the cross for Christ when he was too weak to do it himself. Simon literally took up the cross and followed Christ, walking behind him to Golgotha. So the first reading of the painting is fascinating enough on its own, but there's more. On a second reading, we see Simon is actually Francesco. This makes sense if we take a moment to think about it. The Roman guard would have looked into the crowd to find a man he could press into service to carry the cross. He would have chosen someone young, strong, and of a suitable social class to be forced into the position. But the man in our painting is older, and going by his ring and appearance, someone with wealth and position, not a likely candidate to be pulled from a crowd and pressed into service of carrying a cross. It is believed Francesco didn't just commission the painting, but that he asked Titian to paint him into it. Zuccato is the model for Simon the Cyrene. The painting was going into his private chapel, and this work would enable him to visualize his commitment to Christ and his willingness to suffer with him. The painting is literally Zuccato taking up the cross and following Christ. Seeing himself in this painting each day would be a powerful motivator as he left his chapel and went about his day. On a third level, it has been suggested that Titian melded the painting of Francesco with the figure of God the Father from Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. They're remarkably similar. The Sistine Chapel had been painted years earlier, and Titian was familiar with the images there. By giving a nod to that painting, Titian adds another layer of complexity and meaning. God the Father's plan for the salvation of mankind demands much from Christ. The idea we normally have is God sitting in heaven while Christ is on earth suffering and dying. Titian gives us an additional idea, that perhaps God was walking alongside Christ, helping his Son to bear the weight of what was to come. As we spend time with this painting, we have several things to direct a meditation. We have Christ's face. Jesus, as we gaze into your face, we are filled with love and gratitude for the sacrifice you made on our behalf. Simon the Cyrene. I pray that we can respond as Simon. When we find ourselves unexpectedly called into service, I pray that we would willingly take up our cross and follow Christ. I pray that each time we will be changed and that our lives will be a testimony leading to the salvation of others. Simon as Zuccato. As we contemplate Zuccato and his desire to have a painting that reminds him that he too must take up the cross of Christ, we are challenged by his example. Simon as God the Father. Father, our hearts are encouraged knowing that when we take up our cross, when we walk through the difficult times of life, that you are there beside us, lifting the weight of the cross from our shoulders and giving us relief. We are reminded that your yoke is easy and your burden is light. Strengthen us, Lord, to walk the path that you have set before us.
I love you, Baba.